In the summer of 2023, the owner of an all-night medical shop in Kathmandu was busy restocking shelves. It was late, sometime after midnight, but the man didn't mind. He liked working the overnight shift. It was quiet, and some nights nobody came in at all, which gave him time to do the accounting. But the peace and quiet was shattered when two drunken men in their 20s stumbled inside. One of them was covered in blood and leaning hard on the other, barely conscious. The uninjured man explained that his companion needed to be stitched up quick. The shop owner happened to know basic emergency medicine, so he jumped into action. He cleared off the table in the corner of a store and then told the friend to lay the injured man out on the table. Then he went to the back to get his sutures kit. By the time the shop owner returned to the front of the shop, the injured man was lying there babbling drunken nonsense and clutching his stomach. The owner wasted no time though. He rolled a stool up to the table and lifted up the man's shirt. There was this nasty gash in the man's abdomen. It took him a few minutes to clean the wound and staunch the bleeding with gauze. After that, he worked quickly to stitch the edges of the cut back together. After he was done, the friend thanked the shop owner and paid him what little cash he had in his pocket. And then he assured the shop owner he would get his injured friend back home safely. Once the two men left and the shop owner began cleaning up the bloodstained table, he also began thinking to himself how glad he was that he was able to help. That man could have easily bled to death, but now he'd be just fine once he sobered up. But the shop owner had no idea that by this time tomorrow, that drunk injured man would have much bigger problems than a bleeding wound. From Ballin Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballin, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. So, if you like today's story, tell the follow button you'd be happy to fix their broken air conditioner. But when you actually work on it, just smash it repeatedly with a hammer and then leave. When it comes to medical problems, there's nothing quite as mysterious as abdominal pain. And it's not just because of the discomfort it causes. It's because our abdomens have a ton of organs, so that pain could be coming from anywhere. Whether it's our stomachs, our intestines, our livers, our kidneys, there are so many vital components that can go haywire. And so on that note, today's episode features two stories about patients with horrible abdominal pain that ends up being caused by something totally unbelievable. The first story is about a young man backpacking through Nepal whose trip is derailed by a shocking trip to the hospital. And the second story is about a mysterious salmonella outbreak that sickened children all around Denver, Colorado, with one strange connection between all of them. And now, here is our first episode called A Clean Break. In the summer of 2023, a 22-year-old backpacker named Jeff was out late, drinking at a bar in Kathmandu, Nepal. Jeff had been traveling alone through South Asia over the past few weeks, and he just arrived in Kathmandu from India. So far, he loved Nepal. Over the past 2 days, he'd been exploring all the temples, markets, and food stalls that filled the bustling 2,000-year-old capital. He'd been going out to bars every night after dinner, hanging with locals and fellow tourists alike. Tonight, he'd chosen a bar that was full of people about his age, and the music was all Western pop tunes, so it sort of reminded him of being home. Jeff ordered a potent Nepalese drink called Roxy and struck up a conversation with the man on the next bar stool. He bought his new friend a Roxy as well, and they talked about Jeff's travels for a while. Then someone else joined the conversation, at which point Jeff decided it was time to buy some shots. By the time he paid his bar tab a few hours later, Jeff could barely see straight. He stood up from his bar stool, but he could hardly feel his feet. He only knew he was standing upright because he felt so dizzy. He staggered his way through the crowd. It felt like he was trudging through peanut butter. He swayed a little and stumbled backwards into the group of guys he'd been talking to all evening. They laughed at him, and one of the men gave him a playful push in the back, which sent him spinning into another group of men he didn't know. And these guys did not think the drunken man was so funny. They shoved Jeff back into his original group of friends, but a lot less gently this time. Soon enough, both groups were shoving and pushing, and the last thing Jeff remembered was the feel of someone's fist exploding against his cheekbone. The next morning, Jeff woke up in his hostel bed with the worst headache of his life. It felt like his head had been stuffed in a vice grip. He remembered getting punched the night before, but had no memory of what happened next or how he got home. Frankly, he was just glad to be back in his hostel bed and in one piece, even if his head was pounding. Jeff knew he had some painkillers in his bag somewhere, but the idea of just rifling through his belongings made him feel dizzy, so instead, he just reached for the half-empty bottle of water on his bedside and chugged it down in a single gulp. He felt better for about 30 seconds, but then vomit surged up his throat and he had to dive for the trash can on the far side of the room. He spent the next 5 minutes with his arms wrapped around the trash can, purging the contents of his stomach. It made him feel better, but he was still very achy and nauseous, and he also now had a sharp pain in his gut. It almost felt like he'd pulled a muscle in there or something. Jeff crawled back to his bed and flopped onto the mattress. He decided he would spend the rest of the day in bed, sleeping off this hangover. When Jeff finally woke up again later that day, the sun was setting outside his window. His headache was dull now, and the room had stopped spinning. But the pain in his gut felt sharper, and there was an edge to it that he'd never felt before. Now, Jeff didn't want to be alarmist, but he was all alone in a foreign country very far from home, and so he had this feeling that he should just go to the local emergency room and make sure everything was okay. After a quick dinner break, Dr. Anil Singh walked into the waiting room of the emergency department at the Shankarapur Hospital in Kathmandu. He called his next patient, a foreign tourist named Jeff. Dr. Singh specialized in gastrointestinal problems, and he'd been called down to take a look at Jeff's stomach. He led Jeff to a small examination room, and as they walked there, the doctor immediately noticed the smell of stale alcohol radiating off of Jeff. But he didn't say anything. Instead, once they got to the room, the doctor asked Jeff if he'd been experiencing any symptoms like constipation or stomach distension. And Jeff shook his head and said no. He said he had been hungover and he felt nauseous from it, but that was not why he was at the hospital. The reason he was at the hospital was because of this new shooting pain in his stomach. Dr. Singh nodded and then put on a fresh pair of latex gloves and told Jeff to lie down on the table. After he had, the doctor lifted up Jeff's shirt and instantly saw a large bandage taped over Jeff's abdomen. And then beneath it was a 3-inch long cut with fresh sutures stitching up his skin. Whoever had done the sutures had done a good job, but Dr. Singh was pretty certain this was why Jeff's stomach hurt. He told Jeff that his sutures looked clean and asked where he got the injury. But Jeff looked so confused. He looked at his stomach and then back up at Dr. Singh with this horrified look on his face. Jeff said he had no idea where that injury even came from. He said he remembered getting punched in the face last night at the bar, but had no memory of anything after that, certainly didn't recall getting cut or seeing any kind of doctor who might have stitched him up. Dr. Singh cocked an eyebrow and looked at Jeff like, really? You had no idea you had a wound on your stomach? But as Jeff continued to look totally shocked by this wound, the doctor concluded that maybe Jeff really was telling the truth, that he really didn't know about this cut. And so Dr. Singh examined the wound more closely and told Jeff that it looked like someone had cut him open, like that's what the injury was, you've been cut. And so Dr. Singh ordered an x-ray just to see what was going on in there. Jeff nodded like he understood, but his eyes were staring off into the distance and he had a totally frightened look on his face. He asked the doctor if it was possible that someone had stolen an organ from him while he was blacked out drunk. He'd always heard that in some countries there was a black market for kidneys, but Dr. Singh smiled and told him that that probably did not happen to him. An hour later, Dr. Singh received Jeff's x-ray, and when he pulled it up on his computer to take a look, he was absolutely floored. And so he rushed back to Jeff's hospital room and asked him to tell him whatever he could remember about the night before. And so Jeff saw the urgency on the doctor's face, but admitted that as much as he wanted to remember, it really was all a blur. He remembered drinking way too much and getting punched in the face at some point, but he had no idea how he had gotten back to his hostel room after that. Dr. Singh was in awe of how drunk Jeff must have been to have basically no memory of the night before. But he told Jeff that ultimately he would be okay, but based on his x-ray, he would have to get in the operating room right away. He needed immediate surgery. Jeff, who was already pale, got even paler and asked Dr. Singh to explain what was wrong with him. What did he find? Dr. Singh sighed, sat down next to Jeff, and then broke the incredible news. The moment those X-ray images came back, Dr. Singh knew exactly what was causing Jeff's discomfort. There was a 6-inch long knife blade lodged inside of Jeff's body. Dr. Singh told Jeff that at some point the night before, he must have been stabbed, and apparently stabbed so hard that the knife blade had broken off inside of his abdomen. And somehow, Jeff was so drunk, he didn't remember any of it. Dr. Singh decided to call the bar, hoping that somebody there would know the whole story. And luckily, the bartender who answered the phone had been working there the night before and had seen the whole thing. Jeff had made some friends at the bar last night, but apparently he had made some enemies too. And during the physical altercation that ensued with these enemies, someone stabbed Jeff with what looked like a chef's knife, and then one of the onlookers took Jeff to the nearest medical shop, which are these 24-hour pharmacies that can be found all over Kathmandu. And so once they got there, the onlooker begged the shop owner to sew Jeff up, and the shop owner did, even though he was not a doctor. And because he was not a doctor, the shop owner, before stitching him up, didn't think to check whether there were any foreign objects inside of Jeff first, hence the knife being left inside of Jeff. And then afterwards, when Jeff was sleeping off his hangover back at his hostel, that knife blade traveled inside of him through his innards until it was lodged deep inside of Jeff's torso. It was a miracle that it didn't cause further damage to Jeff's internal organs as it worked its way deeper into the muscle of his abdominal cavity. And so it was no wonder Jeff was in extreme pain by the time he got to the ER. Jeff was taken to the operating room, where surgeons were able to extract the knife blade from his abdominal cavity. Then they patched him up, and he was discharged from the hospital 5 days later. Ultimately, Jeff would travel back to his home country once he was healthy enough to travel, and although he couldn't remember the most exciting part of his trip, getting stabbed, he would always have the scar as a souvenir. And now, here's our second story, called Look, Don't Touch. On the morning of January 14th, 1996, Alana Rugen carried her 6-year-old son, Jaden, as they walked towards the Tropical Discovery Center at the Denver Zoo. She was eager to get out of the cold, especially since most of the exhibits they'd visited so far had been outside. They'd seen the penguins, the tigers, and the gorillas, but Jaden loved snakes, so the reptiles at the Discovery Center were like the main event. Alana let Jaden run ahead of her as they entered the building. And then after going inside and collecting her son, they went to sit in a little auditorium that normally showed a short reptile documentary. But this afternoon, the movie was turned off, and 2 zookeepers were welcoming a small crowd to fill the seats. After the audience was seated, the zookeepers began bringing out all kinds of snakes and lizards and tortoises, holding them up for the kids to see, and also telling the audience all about the animals and where they came from. Alana watched her son's eyes light up when they brought out a massive 12-foot-long boa constrictor and stretched him out on the floor, his forked tongue flicking in and out of his mouth. Alana was thrilled that she'd signed her son up for this little excursion. He seemed to be really enjoying it so far. Just then, one of the zookeepers carried a lizard into the bleachers so the kids could get a closer look. Jaden immediately reached out his hand to try and pet the lizard, but Alana grabbed him and pulled his hand back before he could make contact. The zookeepers had been very clear that this event was a reptile meet and greet, not a meet and touch. By the time the show was over, Jaden was buzzing. He was jumping up and down and telling his mom all about his favorite animals and what he remembered about each one. She smiled as she led him to the next exhibit, called Komodo Days. It was a limited-time indoor exhibit that had just opened a few days earlier, showcasing 4 of the largest lizards on Earth, called Komodo dragons. Each of the animals was bigger than Jaden, and that was actually still small for a Komodo dragon. Alana overheard someone reading from a plaque that said these animals could grow up to 10 feet long and weigh about 350 pounds. The zoo was hoping to raise enough funds to build a large permanent enclosure for these new arrivals to the zoo. For the time being, though, these giant lizards were being kept in a temporary exhibit, enclosed by a 2-foot-tall wooden barrier, which the lizards were not capable of climbing over. To make sure nobody got too close, there was a line of plants in front of the barrier, all surrounded by a chain and post fence. Alana was more than happy to keep her distance. She had to admit that the Komodo dragons were cool, although their exhibit smelled horrible, like damp mulch and manure. But Jaden was so excited, he barely seemed to notice. Alana stood with Jaden right behind the fence, and from where they were standing, they had a good view into the enclosure. Alana thought the dragons looked a bit like alligators, with big heads and short stubby legs and long muscular tails. She then leaned over and began to read from the plaque of animal facts fastened to the barrier. She told Jaden that apparently these dragons were poisonous and had razor-sharp teeth, and they eat almost any kind of meat, from rodents to water buffaloes. Jaden listened and watched in fascination as the dragons lumbered around their enclosure, their big nails crunching on the mulch that had been put on the floor. He giggled as one of the dragons stood up on a rock and stuck its big yellow tongue out, hissing at the crowd. Jaden was so entranced by these dragons that he leaned over the fence to get a better look, and actually reached towards a Komodo dragon that was only a few feet away, near the edge of its enclosure. And as this happened, that same dragon put its paws up on the 2-foot wooden wall to get a better look at Jaden. Alana saw this and gasped and grabbed her son and pulled him back. All that was separating him from one of the deadliest predators on Earth was a line of decorative bushes. Thankfully, she had pulled him away in time, although it felt way too close for comfort. Alana let Jaden continue to watch the Komodo dragons, but this time a little bit farther back from the barrier. And then after about 15 minutes, Alana's stomach began to rumble, so she told her son they needed to leave now, but they would stop at the cafeteria and grab some food before heading home. A few mornings later, Alana went upstairs to wake her son for school. But when she entered Jaden's room, he complained that his stomach hurt, and he was afraid that he was going to throw up. Now, normally Jaden was pretty enthusiastic about school, so Alana decided he must really be sick. So she told him he would stay home today and rest up, and then she went and got him some Gatorade. A few hours later, Alana was in the kitchen grabbing saltine crackers for Jaden when she heard him cry upstairs. She ran upstairs and found him still in bed, but now sweating with a fever and shivering with chills at the same time. When she took his temperature, it read 104 degrees. Alana was shocked. This seemed more serious than just a 24-hour bug, and so she decided to bring him to the doctor. But before they left to go see the doctor, she had Jaden use the bathroom and discovered he was passing bloody diarrhea, which really scared her. Once he was cleaned up, she rushed him out the front door and sped to the hospital as fast as she could. About 10 days later, on January 26th, Dr. Barbara Raffa knocked on Alana's front door. Dr. Raffa was an investigator with the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, and had recently learned that Jaden was one of 7 children in the Denver metro area who had been infected with a strain of salmonella called Salmonella enteritis that's commonly found in poultry and other animals. Dr. Raffa and her team were trying to figure out where the children had picked up the salmonella bacteria, which is usually spread by consuming contaminated food or water or having contact with infected animals. The doctor reassured Alana that most people recover from a salmonella infection, but it can be dangerous to young kids. In fact, if kids go untreated for salmonella, they can die. Dr. Raffa had spent the past few days interviewing the families with the kids who were sick with salmonella and had asked hospitals to report any new cases. She had the sinking feeling that this was the beginning of an outbreak, so she and her team needed to act fast to figure out what was going on here. Alana knew her son had salmonella poisoning, but had no idea that other kids were also getting salmonella poisoning too. Dr. Raffa followed Alana to the kitchen, and the pair sat down at the kitchen table, and Dr. Raffa asked how Jaden was doing. Alana said her son was upstairs sleeping and still was a bit tired and weak, but he seemed to be recovering. She had taken him to the emergency room last week, where he was diagnosed with salmonella based on his symptoms. He'd been given fluids and antibiotics, which had definitely helped him get better. The hospital monitored him for a few days until the salmonella had passed through his body. Dr. Raffa told Alana how relieved she was that Jaden was okay. But now she was hoping to try to stop the spread of the salmonella strain before it affected more kids. And so she said she had a list of questions she wanted to ask Alana in the hopes that maybe she could help her figure out exactly how Jaden got sick. Alana nodded and said she was eager to help. Dr. Raffa began by asking if she and her son had gone anywhere unusual over the past 2 weeks. Alana shrugged and said not really, except they did go to the zoo the weekend before last. She said they'd gone to see the reptiles. By now, Dr. Rafa had been expecting this answer. Every other family she'd spoken to whose kid was sick with salmonella told her they had gone to the Discovery Center at the zoo, which made it obvious to Dr. Rafa that this particular strain of salmonella had to be stemming from something in that building. So now it was time to head to the zoo and figure out what that might be. The next day, Dr. Rafa and her colleagues arrived at the Tropical Discovery Center. As the zookeeper led her and her colleagues through the employees-only area of the exhibit, Dr. Rafa felt a sense of urgency. By now, Dr. Rafa had identified 33 children who had contracted the same strain of salmonella as Jaden over the past 2 weeks. And each family had this one thing in common. They had all visited this Discovery Center. And so now it was extremely apparent that something in this building was behind the kids getting sick. And for all Dr. Rafa knew, kids were actively being exposed to salmonella right now. So far, they'd been lucky. All 33 families of the sick kids had taken their children to a hospital, so they were all going to be fine. However, Dr. Rafa worried that eventually, if this outbreak continued, that a family would think whatever was going on with their kids was just a mild stomach bug. And then by the time they realized their mistake, it would be too late for their child. She pushed that thought from her mind and went back to work. She had to figure out which animal or exhibit was carrying the salmonella bacteria, and most importantly, how the kids were coming into contact with it. And that was proving to be a real mystery. As Dr. Rafa walked through the Discovery Center, she noticed that almost all of the exhibits were completely sealed off. There was no way for the public to come in contact directly with any of the reptiles or any of their environments. She asked the zookeeper about the animals they used in their daily education shows. She wondered if maybe the kids were allowed to touch any of them. But the zookeeper shook his head. He told her that the public never touched any of the animals because that was unsafe for both the people and the animals. But Dr. Rafa wasn't convinced. She said she wanted stool samples from all of the education animals just to make sure they weren't carrying the salmonella bacteria. She also wanted samples from the rodents that were used to feed those animals, because she was not going to take any chances. About 20 minutes later, Dr. Rafa scooped up a bit of fecal matter from a blue-tongued skink and dropped it into a tiny plastic tube. Then she labeled it for testing back in the lab. Along the back hallway, her teammates were collecting stool samples from corn snakes, the big boa constrictor, and all the other reptiles used in the daily show. And they were making good progress, which she was glad for. She kept imagining a sick child in bed at home, their parents unaware that their stomach bug was actually a potentially deadly disease from their trip to the zoo. She hurried the sample she had just collected to a small examination room down the hallway, an area that was usually for veterinary visits, but that her team was using now as a home base while they examined the Discovery Center. And when she got there, it was then that Dr. Rafa remembered the Komodo dragon exhibit that they had passed on the way in. She had a thought. The Komodo dragons were a new exhibit. And even though the Komodo dragons were kept out of reach of the public, the timing of their arrival and the outbreak of this disease was too close to ignore. Curious, she went to find the zookeeper. She wanted samples from all 4 of the dragons, hoping that her gut feeling would solve this mystery. On the morning of February 1st, so about 2 weeks after Jaden got sick, Dr. Paul Nelson arrived at the Denver Zoo, alongside a small team of fellow investigators from the Centers for Disease Control, or CDC. A few days earlier, all the samples that Dr. Rafa had collected came back from the lab, and all of the animals were salmonella-free except one, a Komodo dragon. And it tested positive for the exact strain of salmonella that had infected all the children. So now, Dr. Rafa had clearly identified the source of the salmonella outbreak, but an equally important question was looming. How could the kids come into contact with the bacteria that was on this Komodo dragon when they and the public were not allowed to touch the Komodo dragons in the first place? The dragons and the public were clearly separated by a low plywood wall, a row of bushes, and a fence. And so Dr. Rafa was stumped, and that's why she had called the CDC to take over the case. A zoo administrator welcomed Dr. Nelson and his colleagues into the Discovery Center and then led them into a back room where 6 other zoo employees were waiting. Most of them were the zookeepers who worked directly with the infected Komodo dragon. And so Dr. Nelson said he needed stool samples from all of them to make sure that none of them were sick and spreading the salmonella strain themselves when they interacted with the public. Dr. Nelson also said they would need additional fecal samples from some of the animals at the center just to play it safe. And then after that, Dr. Nelson's teammates spread out all across the Discovery Center and began collecting samples of their own. Not fecal samples, but surface samples. They were swabbing basically every surface they possibly could. Everything from the plants to the fences to the mulch on the ground. By the time Dr. Nelson and his team left the zoo an hour later, they had this massive bag full of samples to test. About 5 days later, Dr. Nelson returned to the Discovery Center with surprising news about the CDC's analysis of all the samples they had taken. In addition to finding the Salmonella strain in the Komodo dragon's stool, they had also found the Salmonella strain in a very unlikely place. It was sitting on top of the wooden barrier that was supposed to keep the dragons away from the public. Dr. Nelson admitted to the zoo officials that he was really confused. And so he just kind of began walking around near the Komodo dragon enclosure, wondering, how could the Salmonella get there? And right as he walked over to the fence, he noticed one of the dragons walking over to him to kind of check him out. And a second later, the dragon stood up on its hind legs and propped its paws right on the wooden barrier. And suddenly, it all made sense. It would turn out the Komodo dragon enclosure was covered with mulch. The Komodo dragons slept in that mulch, walked in that mulch, and went to the bathroom in that mulch. Then they occasionally put their feet up on the wooden barrier to get a better look at their guests, transferring bits of salmonella-infected mulch and fecal matter onto the wooden fence in the process. The children, meanwhile, were so excited to see these giant lizards that they were leaning way over the security fence and sometimes actually touching the top of the wooden barrier. They didn't know it, but they were actually getting salmonella on their hands. And so at that point, if the kids didn't wash their hands, all they would have to do to get infected with the salmonella would be to just brush their nose or rub their eyes, or in Jaden's case, eat some food with their bare hands. Thankfully, the salmonella outbreak was treated fast enough that all 33 infected children made full recoveries. And the Denver Zoo managed to raise enough money for the Komodo dragon exhibit that they could build a permanent enclosure, this one completely sealed off from the public. It's actually still at the Denver Zoo today, and there has not been a single salmonella outbreak in nearly 2 decades. On the afternoon of June 15, 1988, a man named Keith Reinard drove down the main street of a tiny town called Silver Plume, which is located in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. In his car was everything Keith would need to live for the next 3 months. Silver Plume was the kind of place that most people would just pass by on the highway without even considering stopping. It was kind of a no-name town in the middle of nowhere. In the 1800s, it had been a booming mining town. However, now all but 140 of its residents had either died or moved away. In fact, Silver Plume was considered a living ghost town because of how close it was to being totally abandoned. But this emptiness and kind of middle of nowhere-ness was exactly what appealed to Keith about this town. Keith was 49 years old and lived over 1,000 miles away to the east in a suburb of Chicago, Illinois. And Keith had a great life. He was married with 2 kids, a boy and a girl. He had a good job working for a newspaper covering high school sports, and he had a beautiful house. But for Keith, he felt like as good as his life looked on paper, it was missing something. There was one thing he had always wanted to do, but had always put off doing, and that was to write a book. And not just any book, a book that lots of people were going to read, a great American classic. That's what he wanted to make. But there was just one problem. Keith had no idea what this big book was going to be about. And that was why he had come to Silver Plume. Keith had taken a 3-month leave from his job and left his wife and his kids and the city all behind to come out to this town to hopefully, in this new, peaceful, quiet environment, find the inspiration he really needed to not only discover what this book would be about, but to sit down and actually write it. Keith's wife had not been happy about this plan, him kind of being gone for 3 months, not providing any income, not helping with the kids. But she could tell Keith really felt like he needed to do this, and so she gave him her blessing. After arriving on Main Street in Silver Plume, Keith looked up and he saw KP Cafe off to the right. It was a weathered old building that looked like it was straight out of a cowboy movie, and this cafe was exactly the landmark that Keith had been looking for. And so he pulled his car over on the side of the road, he got out, he stretched, and then he began walking towards this cafe. This cafe was the big hangout spot in Silver Plume for all of its 140 residents, and the reason Keith knew this was because his best friend from high school, Ted Parker, owned KP Cafe. Ted had actually been the person who inspired Keith to come to Silver Plume in the first place. He had told him about how peaceful and serene this place was, the best environment for a writer. And when Keith had told Ted that sounds great, I'm going to do it, I'm going to come to Silver Plume, Ted had told him that he also owned the store right next to KP Cafe. It used to be a bookstore, but the previous tenant who ran the bookstore had talked about some big European vacation he was going on and then had just kind of vanished. And so for months now, this storefront had been vacant. And so Ted had told Keith that while he was in town, he was more than welcome to work and write out of this vacant bookshop. And so Keith, after walking up to the front window of KP Cafe, he looked inside and didn't see Ted, and so he decided he would take a moment and walk over to this vacant bookshop that would be his office. So he went next door, he pulled out the key that Ted had already sent him in advance, he unlocked the door, and he went inside. And right away, Keith was struck at what he saw. I mean, the place was full of books. Some piles of books were higher than his head, and many of the books looked rare and expensive. And Keith's first thought was, why did this guy who used to run this store just abandon all of this? This had to cost a lot of money. But Keith was far too excited about the next few months and getting this book done that he didn't really think too hard about whatever the previous owner had done. And instead, he just began to daydream about what the next few months would be like and how this book was going to turn out. And as Keith was thinking about his big book project, Ted actually came into the bookstore, and when the two friends saw each other, they ran up to each other and embraced, and then before long, the two of them had gone outside and began walking around Silver Plume, just chatting and catching up. And eventually, after chatting and walking around for a really long time, the pair left Silver Plume and wound up walking onto this hiking trail that went up into the woods. Now, years earlier, Ted and Keith had both been avid hikers and outdoorsmen, but now, Keith had put on some weight and he really wasn't a big hiker anymore, but Ted didn't really know that. And so Ted, he's leading this hike up this trail as they're still kind of chatting and making light of things. But Keith, as he was struggling to keep up, was getting more and more anxious about this hike, and he also had a deep fear of heights, and this trail appeared to go really high up this mountain. But Keith kept telling himself that, he was here in Silver Plume as much to write this book as he was to kind of have a little more adventure in his life. And so he just kept on trudging along after Ted. But eventually, Keith just could not handle how high up they were getting. He was totally terrified of being able to see the valley way down below. And so he had a sort of panic attack where he lunged and grabbed a nearby tree and hugged it like it was the only thing keeping him from falling off the mountain. And when Ted turned around and saw Keith, he rushed over to him and said, "Don't worry, everything is okay." He convinced him to let go of the tree, and then very carefully, Keith and Ted walked back down the trail back into town. And when they got down there, Ted would tell Keith he was so sorry for putting Keith in such a stressful position, and Keith kind of brushed it off and said, it's totally fine, no big deal. Even though this panic attack was very embarrassing for Keith, he wound up just kind of shifting his mental focus to getting settled into this new life he was going to be living for the next few months. And so along with this office space in this old abandoned bookstore that Keith would be using, he also rented a small apartment in the little church in town. And very quickly, Keith developed a sort of daily routine. He would get up early in his apartment and he would make his way over to the bookstore and he would sit down at his computer and he would write all day. But even though Keith was doing a lot of writing, it was not productive writing. It was mostly Keith sitting down, trying to come up with the topic for his book, not being able to do it, and then he just sort of drifted off and began doing journal entries and writing snippets of poetry, and then before long the day was over and he had accomplished nothing. And so at the end of June, roughly 2 weeks after Keith had arrived in town, he was sitting at his computer one morning inside of the bookshop, unable to write anything productive, and he told himself, I gotta do something to break out of this writer's block. Writer's block is when writers kind of hit a psychological wall and just can't seem to be creative. They can't write. And so Keith decided, in order to kind of get out of this funk, that he would go back up into the mountains again. He would face his fear of heights, and he would get to the summit, and that clean mountain air and all the nature around him would kind of bring him back to reality and give him the inspiration he would need to just write this book. And so Keith turned off his computer, he left the bookstore, he went back to his apartment in the church, he packed some sandwiches and some water into a backpack, and then he walked from the church apartment to the nearby trail that would lead out of Silver Plume and up into the forest and into the mountains. It was a hot day that day, but as soon as Keith was underneath the shade of all the trees, it was very cool, and the sounds of the birds and the insects and other animals all around him was very calming. But very quickly, Keith's hike went from very peaceful and relatively flat to very intimidating and very steep. But Keith, he was determined to do this hike. He felt like it was a critical step in the creation of this book. And so he just kept on going one foot after another, huffing and panting and making his way up this incredibly steep trail. And it was like with every step he took, he felt braver and braver. And suddenly he was able to look down at the valley below and not feel as frightened. And then at some point, as he was walking up, he saw all these scratch marks on a tree that were obviously from a mountain lion. But instead of Keith feeling scared, he felt more brave. He felt excited. He felt like this is what he came here for. This book and adventure kind of coming together in this moment. Finally, Keith made it to the top of this trail, and he found this incredible clearing that looked down over the town below. And in this clearing was a monument to a man named Clifford Griffin, who had died at this exact spot 100 years earlier. Keith knew Clifford's story. Back in 1887, when Silver Plume was a booming mining town, Clifford, who was a mine owner, came up to this exact spot in the mountains to play his violin. And then after playing it for a bit, he stopped and dug a grave, stood on the edge of it, shot himself, and fell into the hole. No one knew why he did that, but within a couple of years, the mining industry came to a halt in Silver Plume and everybody just kind of vanished. And very quickly, rumors began to swirl around the people who remained in Silver Plume, how, their town must be cursed. And maybe it was connected to what happened to poor old Clifford. After staring at this monument for a few minutes, Keith turned his attention to lunch. He pulled off his backpack, took out a sandwich, and he began eating. And as he ate, he looked back at this monument, and he thought of another strange Silver Plume story, except this one hit much closer to home. It was about the man who used to run the bookstore where Keith now did all of his writing out of. This man's name was Tom Young, and it would turn out what Keith had heard about Tom when Keith first arrived in Silver Plume was not entirely correct. Keith had been told that Tom had been talking about this European vacation, and so the consensus was that, he had left town and gone to Europe and just not come back. But the reality was, once Keith began asking around a little bit over those first couple of weeks he was there, was that Tom actually had been talking about this big European vacation, but then had walked into the woods up into the mountains, where Keith was right now, where this monument was, and Tom had just vanished, apparently, in these mountains. Tom apparently had been a very quirky guy who had come to Silver Plume in the 1970s to kind of start a new life for himself. He had been teaching high school students in Denver, but he apparently didn't really like doing that and wanted to start over, and so that was what drew him to Silver Plume. And in Silver Plume, residents always saw Tom, along with his best friend, Gus, his black Labrador retriever, walking around town playing fetch. But instead of using a ball, Tom would throw a chewed-up doll's head. And then, on September 7th, 1987, so roughly 9 months before Keith arrived in Silver Plume, Tom and his dog Gus had gone for a hike in the woods where Keith was, and then vanished. Now, at first, people assumed that because Tom had been talking a lot about going on this European vacation right before he vanished, that must be where he went. But when people checked his shop, they saw all of his books were still in there. It did not appear like he had packed things up. And when the sheriff looked into it, he couldn't find any evidence that Tom had ever bought any plane tickets to go to Europe. And so no one really knew what happened to Tom. It was like this big mystery. And so as Keith was standing in this clearing near this monument, thinking about Tom and his story, Keith began to realize there were a lot of similarities between him, Keith, and Tom. They both, as adults, had come to Silver Plume, this kind of random place in the middle of Colorado, to get a sort of second chance in life. And they both worked out of the exact same storefront. And Keith had done some additional digging on Tom when he heard about this mystery and learned that they were almost the exact same age. Their birthdays were separated by 1 day. Also, Keith discovered that he and Tom had served in the military at almost the exact same time in the 1960s. And so as Keith was going over all these strange coincidences and weird similarities between his life and Tom's, suddenly Keith stopped chewing his sandwich and just quickly packed everything back up. He turned and began running down the trail, going back towards town. And as he ran, Keith smiled because he realized he had just discovered what his great American classic novel was going to be about. It was going to be about Tom. For the entire month of July, all Keith did was write. He was in his office 7 days a week typing away, and then at night when he went back to his apartment, his neighbors would see the lights on all night long. At the end of July, so by this point Keith has been living in Silver Plume for about a month and a half, 2 hunters from Silver Plume began hiking up that same mountain trail that led up into the mountains and into the forest that Keith had gone on recently and found his inspiration for his novel. And so these 2 hunters, they're making their way up the trail, and at some point they leave the marked trail and begin kind of meandering through the trees. And as they're walking, they're kind of looking for a clearing to set up for the day. And at one point, one of the hunters happens to look up and he sees there's this really bright white thing sitting at the base of a tree in a clearing. And so these 2 hunters make their way up to this bright white thing, and as soon as they're looking down at it, they realize they have very likely stumbled on a crime scene. At their feet was this green tarp that was partially exposing this white skeleton underneath. And when they pulled back the green tarp a little bit, they saw it was a human skeleton and a dog skeleton kind of lying next to each other as if the 2 of them had lied down and died there. But what was immediately apparent to these 2 hunters is that both the human skull and the dog skull had gaping holes in them, like they had been shot. And several feet away from the skeletons was a rusted pistol. And so these 2 hunters, after staring at the scene in front of them for a couple of seconds, they took a mental note of where they were on the mountain, and then they turned around and headed back down to town to tell the sheriff. And when the sheriff went up with his deputies to go search the scene themselves, they very quickly identified that these remains belonged to Tom Young and his dog Gus. And the sheriff also found out that that pistol that was found several feet away from the 2 skeletons had been purchased by Tom just a few days before he had vanished. And so the sheriff decided that what must have happened is Tom brought his dog up into the mountains, and after shooting his dog, Tom turned and shot himself. This was a suicide. Case closed. But this explanation didn't make any sense to the people of Silver Plume. First of all, Tom loved his dog Gus. Gus was basically like his child because Tom didn't have any other family, and so why would he hurt his dog? Also, Tom was not acting remotely like someone who was going to commit suicide in the days leading up to his death. People saw him at the grocery store buying a whole bunch of groceries. He talked endlessly about how excited he was about this big European vacation. And then there was this one other thing that also made suicide seem very unlikely. When those 2 hunters had discovered Tom and Gus, they were partially covered by that green plastic tarp. But it looked very much like the wind and kind of nature in general had blown the tarp off of them, revealing the white bones that the hunters had seen. But what that meant is that very likely that tarp at one point had been totally covering their bodies. And so between that and the fact that the gun was located several feet away from where Tom was, It seemed to the people of Silver Plume that probably somebody else had shot and killed both Tom and Gus, covered them up with this tarp, and then dumped the gun several feet away. Adding to the theory that this was a murder, not a suicide, were the rumors around town that there was this nuclear weapon production facility somewhere near their town, and apparently they were illegally dumping radioactive materials into these old abandoned mine shafts near and in Silver Plume. And people thought, maybe Tom, who had military training, he was actually in the special forces in the military, maybe he had gone out and done some snooping around and discovered this illegal dumping operation, and that got him killed. When Keith heard that Tom and Gus's bodies had been discovered up in the mountains, it was absolutely devastating for Keith. Even though Keith had never actually met Tom, he still felt like he had a bond with Tom. I mean, he was obsessively writing about Tom and learning everything about him, and he also had all these similarities with Tom, and so it was a really big deal to find out that Tom and Gus were dead. But the silver lining to this tragedy was that Keith was now armed with more information about Tom and his dog, and suddenly the ending to his big novel became clear. And so Keith got right back to work. On August 3rd, 1988, so a couple of days after Tom and Gus's skeletons were found up in the mountains, the town of Silver Plume held a memorial service for Tom. And Keith, he would attend this service, and as he listened to the people of Silver Plume talking about Tom and how he had come to Silver Plume to get this second chance at life, Keith couldn't help but feel like it was almost like he was watching his own memorial service because Tom's life so closely mirrored his own. And then, as he was listening to more and more people talk, Keith started to feel like there was no way Tom killed himself. That can't be what happened. Something else happened to Tom. And Keith was confident that through his research and through doing this book about Tom, he would figure out what happened to him and his dog. As soon as the memorial service ended, Keith quickly slipped out and headed back to his apartment. And when he went inside, he looked around at all the stacks of papers and maps and books that he was using to put together this novel. And he knew that out of all this chaos around him, this novel really was becoming a thing. He was doing it. He was gonna get this book done. But he knew there was one more thing he had to do before he could finish this book. And that was, he had to go back up into the mountains. So, a few days later, on August 7th, at around 4:30 in the afternoon, Keith walked inside of KP Cafe and strolled up to the counter where his buddy, Ted Parker, was sitting there reading a book. Keith paid for a drink and then announced to Ted that he, Keith, was going to leave this cafe and go right up into the mountains again. And so as Keith told Ted his big plan for this hike he was going to go on, Ted just felt totally confused. Ted's looking at Keith knowing this guy is not a confident climber. I mean, they had gone on that one hike partway up the mountain, and Keith had had a panic attack and had to go back down again. Also, at the top of the mountain, it was like 12,000 feet of elevation where the temperatures would be near or below freezing, and here Keith was just wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. He had no other equipment with him, no other warm clothes. Also, the route that Keith was describing to Ted would take at least 6 hours round trip, and it's 4:30 p.m. now. And so Ted's thinking, Keith is going to get trapped up in the mountains in the middle of the night. And so Ted finally says to Keith, "I hope you're joking." But Keith would say, "I am not joking. And in fact, I'm leaving right now." And then before Ted could even protest, Keith turned around and while sipping his drink, just casually walked out of the store and began heading towards the mountains. And Ted, he thought about stopping Keith and really talking some sense into him and getting him not to do this hike. But ultimately, Ted decided to do nothing, and he told himself that he would just check on Keith the next day. And so, the next morning, Ted, instead of going to his cafe, went first to the bookstore next door to see if Keith was in there. But when he got to the door, it was clear Keith was not inside, and the door was locked, and everything was dark. And so, trying not to panic, Ted hopped right back into his car, and he drove over to the church apartment where Keith had been staying. But again, Keith was not there. And right away, Ted is like, "Oh my goodness, Keith is stuck up on the mountain right now. Exactly what I thought was going to happen has happened. And so right away, Ted rushed to the sheriff to tell him that Keith was missing. And after hearing what Ted had to say, the sheriff would end up launching one of the biggest search and rescue efforts in the history of Colorado. Within 24 hours of being informed of Keith's absence, there were hundreds of people, professional searchers, and just locals who wanted to help, combing this mountain trail looking for Keith. There were planes overhead, there were tracking dogs. I mean, this was a really big deal. And by this point, Keith was very well known in Silver Plume. It's a tiny place. Everybody knows each other, and everyone knew that, he was working on this big book. And so people were really worried about Keith. He was one of theirs. But also, the townspeople were very creeped out by the fact that, Keith, who they knew was very similar to Tom, they knew he was writing about Tom, they knew that Keith was working out of the same storefront that Tom had been in, that now Keith had apparently vanished under the exact same circumstances as Tom. He had wandered into the woods, and that was it. And so it just felt like, how could they have these two people go missing in the exact same way? It just wasn't adding up. On August 9th, so 2 days after Keith had gone missing, and so by this point he's still missing, Ted and some friends decided they would go to Keith's apartment and look around and see if maybe there was some clue as to where Keith went or what he was going to do on this hike. And so they went into his apartment, and Ted's friends began fanning out and looking in the bedroom and looking through all the papers and documents all over the floor, and Ted sat down at Keith's computer. And so Ted fired it up. And as soon as it loaded, there was just this one document on the desktop, and it was the book that Keith was writing. And so Ted clicked on it. And right away, after reading just a couple of lines, he was yelling for his friends to come over here and look at this. And one by one, each of these guys came over, and they just could not believe what they were looking at. From the first page of Keith's book, it was clear the setting for his book was Silver Plume, except he renamed it White Plume. He had created all these fictional characters as well that were obviously based on real people, but had renamed them as well. But that was not what shocked Ted and his friends. What shocked them was the main character of this book. His name was Guy Gypsum. Guy Gypsum was a military veteran who had come to White Plume looking for a better life and an opportunity to be closer to nature in rural Colorado. Guy was almost 50 years old, he loved to go hiking, and he worked out of a storefront that was right next to the only cafe in town. Guy Gypsum was both Keith and Tom at the same time. Keith basically had taken Tom's life and Keith's own life and merged them to create this composite character. And when Ted and his friends scrolled to the bottom of this document, they realized that Keith had written an ending for Guy Gypsum's character. These are the final words in this document. Guy Gypsum changed into some hiking boots and donned a heavy flannel shirt. He understood it all now, and his motivations. Guy closed the door and then walked off towards the lush, shadowless Colorado forests above. 5 days later, the search for Keith was called off. He was never found. Some people say Keith wandered up into the mountains and accidentally died of exposure, and someday we'll find his remains somewhere in the forest. But others say, after reading that final line in Keith's book, that Keith did all this on purpose. I mean, he literally lived out the final part of his book. He put on his boots and his heavy flannel shirt and his jeans, and he wandered off into the lush, shadowless Colorado forest above and killed himself in order to perhaps get closer to Tom Young, the man he had kind of become obsessed with after learning they were so similar, and the man he kind of like meshed his own life with and created this weird composite character of these two lives. I mean, it seemed like a guy that had kind of spiraled into madness in writing this book and decided that death was the only way to finish the novel. And still others say, maybe there really is some kind of secret illicit operation happening in or around Silver Plume. Maybe it's that radioactive waste getting dumped into the mines that, Tom discovered and that got him killed. And Keith, in researching Tom, also discovered this illegal thing and that got Keith killed as well. But all of those things are just theories, because today, officially, there is no answer as to what happened to Keith. His case is still open.
Summers in their old landfills, buried by the years that will follow me while I'm away.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. Those are Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Runful. Just search for Ballin Studios